All right, well, Fiona's running a little late, she said she'll be here in a moment, so we'll call to order the Board of Education, oh, I'm sorry, are you in?
You're good?
Sorry, I'll start again. We'll call to order the Board of Education special meeting Wednesday, October 22nd, 6 p.m. Roll call, please.
Mrs. Capabianco will be late. Mr. Hinman?
Here.
Mrs. Hona here. Mr. Kisco?
Here.
Mr. Nargi?
Here.
Mr. Knight?
Here.
Mr. Rader? Here. Mr. Tebow?
Here.
Mr. Traub?
Here.
Mr. Campolita?
Here.
Mrs. Klockow?
Here.
Ms. Lebowski? Here. Mr. Potter?
Here.
Yes, Mrs. Air.
Mrs. Ayer?
Still bleeding for some reason, but that's otherwise no insurance policy.
They fix it. Sorry, I was being disrespectful.
He's only the chairman.
Okay, we're here for a workshop on the Freedom of Information Act. And you are?
I am the guy to give you the workshop.
Excellent. Well,
All
welcome,
right.
guy, to give us the workshop.
My name is Tom Kennick. I am the Public Education Officer at the Freedom of Information Commission. I'm happy to be here, glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, thank you for coming.
All right. The reason I'm here was generated by a complaint that was filed. Oh yeah, all right. The discussion tonight is not about the complaint. It's not about whether you were right or whether you were wrong. It's part of a settlement agreement, which we sometimes do. People say, look, rather than go to Hartford for hearing, why don't you come out and tell us a little bit about FOI, answer our questions, and then maybe we'll do things, in a better way down the road. So this is not about beating you up. This is not about torturing you. Well, it might be torturing you. It's to just try to give you an overview of FOI. I call it FOI 101. So, especially with a smaller group, it works best if you ask questions as we go along. I'll just sort of roll into what I usually do, but stop me. Gee, that's not the way we've done it before. Very possible. Or, that doesn't make sense. Also possible. Stop, ask the questions, and the goal would be that by the time we're done, you have just a better idea of freedom of information than you had before we started, and a comfort zone that was a little larger, so that it's not something that you fear, that you go running, screaming down the hall, no, 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 so that you just have a better sense of what the act is about and what we're about at the commission. Is there another meeting to follow? There was some talk that there might be another meeting to follow, so we're not necessarily restricted. I'm respectful of your time, I get that, so we'll just go over everything and hope that by the time we're done, you feel better about FOI and the things that it's about. Now first, a little bit about me, just so you know, I'm not an attorney. I know, is that good news or bad news? I share that with you because I'm going to give you knowledge based on what I've been taught, almost 14 years of experience at FOI, but no legal opinions, nothing that you can run to court with. I try to present in a fashion that's sort of language that we can all understand, I guess is the best way to put it. Now, in the interest of full disclosure, my last job before I worked for Freedom of Information was the Republican American in Waterbury. So I have a journalistic
We won't hold it
background.
against
That's
you.
right.
There goes all your credibility.
That's right.
Yeah.
And in fact, way back when, this was one of the towns that as an editor I was responsible for.
And we invited you?
Yeah, you did. You did anyway. I try to, if any of you have been around for a while, Bridget Ruthman was one of the reporters. I don't know if that name rings a bell. Joyce Peck, David Smith, they were all part of the team that we had up here. So that's important because it kind of gives me a different perspective. I'm not just sort of spewing the act out at you, because I spend a lot of time on the phone answering questions, a lot of time answering emails from people. That's one of my primary functions. And a lot of times I can anticipate the question as people are starting to ask it, because I was kind of on the other side before. So it's kind of a different perspective. And the third thing that I'll share with you that may or may not be helpful is that I was actually one of you not very long ago. For 10 years I was a member of the Board of Education in my town. I was the chair for the last 5. So when you tell me I don't get it, that's not true either. I do get it. Believe me, I get it, especially at budget time. And it's coming, isn't it? Yes, our favorite time of the year. So So I get that too, but more important that a lot of times I go out and do these workshops and people say, well, you don't understand, we're volunteers, we have real lives, we do other things during the day, and then we come and we sit at these board meetings, people scream at us, tell us we're stupid, you know. I get that too, though, and it's hard. It's almost like a second full-time job, isn't it? Those of you who are board members, it really is, and you don't get a whole lot of credit for it. You know, it's not like you walk down the street to the restaurant and they start throwing food at you, patting you on the back and thanking you for what you do. It can be a thankless job. But I get that too.
They throw food at us for a difference. On top of that, when you ran for office or when you were appointed to your positions, you weren't necessarily thinking about freedom of information. You were thinking about helping the kids in this city, you know, get a better education, keeping things fiscally responsible. But it wasn't necessarily about freedom of information. So you have to kind of stop and think about that for a second because it goes with the territory. It's part of the job. It's the law in the state of Connecticut, and it's something that you need to be aware of, at least to the point where you're following it and you're not in a situation where you're constantly wondering, gee, are we doing the right thing or not? So what we'll do is we'll talk about the different aspects of the law, give you a little bit of background, and try to make your life easier. But the law is 39 years old. It was Ella Grasso's brainchild when she ran for governor for the first time. And if you do the math, 39 years ago puts us right smack in the middle of Watergate. And if you remember Watergate, that was a time when there was a lot of distrust of government, a lot of distrust of things going on. Ella was in Congress when Watergate exploded, and she was really moved, I am told, by those who were around her doing things in secret government, things behind closed doors, things that, you know, really shouldn't have been happening. And when she came back to run for governor, she said, it's really important that we put together some sort of a law that opens up our government so that people understand that we operate above board. And so she made it one of the primary planks in her first campaign platform in 1974 when she ran for governor. And she won, and then she followed through in 1975. Imagine that, a politician saying something. Anyway, she followed through. She followed through, and then she said something that's kind of interesting. She said, you know, this is so important that I'm going to see to it that it's approved unanimously by our legislature. I want you to think about that for a second. You ever watch a legislature in action? Uh-huh. Can you imagine guaranteeing a unanimous vote on that or on anything? Well, I've seen the recording of the votes, and son of a gun, she guaranteed it and she got it. She got not, there wasn't a single no vote, and the law passed. Now, why is that important? It's important because it's based on a pretty simple concept. This is the concept. This is James Madison speaking to us from the mid-1700s. A popular government without popular information or the means of acquiring it is but a prologue to a farce or a tragedy, or perhaps both. A people who mean to be their own governor must arm themselves with the power which knowledge gives. For democracy to work, people need to know what's going on. That's basically what that says. Well, that's the concept upon which this law is built, but who's tried to read it? Has anybody tried to read the pages of the law? It's not that simple. One of the reasons we believe is that when they went to get this unanimous vote, there had to be a lot of, well, of course, I'm in favor of open government, but not when it pertains to that record, or not when it pertains to that meeting. So you've got a lot of areas in it that are clearly open to interpretation. And a lot of folks like yourselves who are on the front line have to look at it sometimes every day and say, okay, wait a minute, is this a record? Yeah, I know it's a public record, but do I release it? Don't I release it? Or should we be in executive session? Shouldn't we be in executive session? And these are decisions that you have to make all the time, and sometimes you're not armed with the tools to make the right decisions. And it's hard. Being on the side where you have to interpret this law, you might do everything absolutely the way you think it's the right thing to do. You believe in open government, and then somebody files a complaint and says, gee, they didn't do it right. Because you're interpreting the law, so is the person on the other side of the issue. They have the same ability to interpret the law. So one of the things that this law did was create the Freedom of Information Commission. It allows people to file complaints against agencies that they believe haven't followed the act properly. And our commission's main role is to adjudicate those complaints, to say, yes, you were right, no, you were wrong. And just because a complaint is filed, or even if you lose a complaint, it doesn't mean you're bad or you're evil or you're against the concept of open government. It means that you've interpreted the law differently than the Freedom of Information Commission. But guess what? It doesn't end there either. our commission gets interpreted too. If you go before the FOI commission and get a decision you're not happy with, you can appeal that decision all the way to the state Supreme Court. And we don't have a perfect record there either. There are times when our interpretation is overturned because there's a constant rereading of the words, and sometimes the words don't take you the way your intuition would take you. They take you in a different direction. So what we'll do is we'll talk about some of those things, and again, try to clarify some of the things that might be a problem for you. Now, the law's about two basic things. It's about access to public meetings and access to public records. A lot of people see freedom of information, and that automatically sets them off in the wrong direction. I suspect those of you who are staffers have had situations when people come in and say, okay, under freedom of information, I need to know this. Tell me this. Give me the answer to that question. And you say, well, wait a minute. And you say, no, freedom of information, I have a right to know it. Anybody had that happen? Freedom of information? They say, right. Maybe even happens at a board meeting. People come in and say, freedom of information, you gotta tell me. Well, it's not really about free information. The first lesson that we try to teach people is it's about access to meetings and access to records. So when people come in and ask questions, you don't necessarily have to answer them. Now, we're all public servants, but there may come a time when they reach the line where you're not comfortable answering the question. Or you'd have to go sort of figure something out to answer the question, and you're not obligated to do it. It's about access to records that have the information they're looking for, or access to a meeting that might produce the information they're looking for, but not necessarily, being a wealth of information. And by the way, yeah,
What if you, when they ask for certain records and and they say the question they're looking for, and it's not there, you still
Okay.
have to give it to them?
my recommendation under those circumstances is always to say, look, I'll give you that, but what you want to find out isn't there. I always recommend trying to work with the requester. And I'll show you an example later when someone who didn't and got into deep, problems. 9 times out of 10, if you work with well, I don't even want to put a number on it because it doesn't always work, but if you work with the requester and say, look, you're looking here for an answer that's here, and if we give you this, you're better off. I'll give you this, but if you take this instead, and a lot of times you'd be surprised how well that works, but nothing stops you from saying you're going in the wrong direction. And a lot of times it'd be better for everybody to go down that road. But I was talking about people coming in and asking questions. People see our name, they see Freedom of Information, and they think we are the information kiosk for the state of Connecticut. We get questions the likes of which you wouldn't believe. First of all, people think that we sit in this huge vault, surrounded by every record held by every agency in the state, and they call us up and they ask us to send them stuff. Can you send me, the police report from the fight at the football game or something? And we have to explain that we're there to make sure that the law is followed, but we don't have all those records. We're not in the position to grab them and send them, and they get very angry at us, but we tell them that's not what we're about. I'll share a little story with you that I find humorous. If you've been to Hartford, if there's a play at the Bushnell, a fairly large play at the Bushnell, they hang flags from the light poles. Have you seen those, the flags at the light poles? A couple years ago, Mary Poppins was coming to the Bushnell. And I told you I spent a lot of time answering phones and stuff like that. So I answered a question about a meeting notice or something like that. And the phone rings, time you got another call, pick up the phone, a woman's on the other end. She says, I am desperate, I need your help. I said, what's the matter? She says, I need tickets to Mary Poppins. I said, what? She says, I need you to get me tickets to Mary Poppins. I said, no, it's not that kind of free information. That's not what we do. We don't do that. I just want you to know I was a good public servant that day. I looked up the number of the Bushnell box office. I gave it to her. Hope she got to see the play, but that's not what, and you may not get anything that extreme, but it's the same thing. Your answer can clearly be, no, we're not in the question and answer business. We're here, that's what freedom of information is about. So we'll talk about meetings, we'll talk about records, and then hopefully we'll have a better understanding. Definition of a meeting in the Freedom of Information Act. Meeting means any hearing or other proceeding of a public agency, any convening or assembly of a quorum of a multi-member public agency, and any communication by or to a quorum of a multi-member public agency, whether in person or by means of electronic equipment, to discuss or act upon a matter over which the public agency has supervision, control, jurisdiction, or advisory power. My advice, folks, is that any time you gather to do a work, you think of it in terms of being a meeting. A lot of us get into trouble with, and I use us advisedly because I was there, well, it's just a workshop, we don't need to worry about FOI. It was just a little conversation that we had on the side, we don't need to worry about FOI. Anytime you gather to do your work, you're having a meeting. You want to think of it in those terms,
and you want to make sure the meeting's properly noticed, that it's open to the public, and then when you're done, there are minutes that reflect what happened at that meeting. Let's form a little subcommittee. It's not the full board. That way we don't have to worry about the FOI. Also the wrong answer. This law applies to all public agencies in the state of Connecticut. I won't read you that definition, it's pretty long, but in that definition is the phrase, including any committee of or created by. So, do you guys do a lot of committee work? Finance, curriculum, yeah, that's the way we used to do it. Those committees are public agencies too, and they need to notice their meetings, make sure they're open to the public, and make sure they're minutes when you're done. People say, well, wait a minute, there wasn't a quorum, we don't need to worry about FOI. It was just a little group. As the former chairman of a board, I wish I could tell you that that were true. Mr. Chairman, where do the best meetings of your board take place? In the parking lot after the meeting, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that ain't good, but it happens. Listen, let's not be naive, let's be realistic, it happens. But the answer I always used to get was, well, Tom, it's not a quorum, we don't have to worry about it. Well, there is a ruling at the appellate court level that says you don't have a quorum, you don't need to worry about FOI. There's also a ruling at the appellate court level that says you don't have a quorum, you still have to worry about FOI. There are two rulings at the appellate court level diametrically opposed. One says yes, one says no. So when people call and ask and say, we didn't have a quorum, do we still need to worry about it? I say, yeah.
They ruled both ways?
They
on-
ruled
on-
both
on-
ways.
On the same issue?
Yeah, you remember Billy Martin?
Sure.
I can see things both ways, that
Sure.
commercial, that Bill or like commercial? Well, it's the same thing, they ruled both ways. The Supreme Court was gonna take it up and said, we'll resolve that for you. And they actually started the case, they started hearing it, they took oral arguments, and then they said, oh, never mind, you guys figure it out. So we're left with what I call dueling rulings, which says that even absent a quorum, you could be having a meeting. Which means that you really want to, now it's a could, it's not an are. I want to be clear about that. But if three of you get together and say, okay, it's not a quorum, we can work up the budget now, that could be a meeting and that could be a problem and you really just don't want to do it. You really just don't want to do it. The law talks to us about three kinds of meetings. Yes, go ahead, you have a question? Yeah.
Just a quick one. Superintendent's going to hire a school teacher.
Yeah.
And I want to be part of that process. We're not any personnel committee,
Mhm.
and all of a sudden, not only do I show up, but the other 8 board members show up as well.
I wouldn't.
It wasn't called as a meeting, no one even knew that the other 8.
I would advise against it, because that's clearly could be, now, it may be a meeting that you could couch in terms of something that you could do in private, an executive session or something, depending on where you're going with it, but it's definitely a meeting and you need to worry about it. You just don't want to do that. Yep. Now, let's suppose you're having lunch with the superintendent and the other 8 board members show up, and you're not talking about board business, although I always say, what else are you going to talk about? But let's say you're not. That's not a meeting. But the idea of gathering together to talk about hiring a teacher, that's clearly a board business, and I would advise against it. Law talks to us about 3 different kinds of meetings. It talks to us about a regular meeting, a special meeting, and an emergency meeting. The regular meeting is a meeting that you have per schedule that you put together. You probably do yours maybe end of June, or maybe even before that. You've got the next school year, you're all set. But it legally has to be available starting in the end of January. Most school districts are a little, they're a little ahead of that curve. And it says we meet on the 1st and 3rd Tuesday, the 2nd and 4th Wednesday, whatever that is, that's your regular meeting schedule. Is this your meeting room? You usually meet in here?
In the summer, the rest of the time we're at the high school. when
At the
building's
high school, so that all your fans can come in.
Yes.
That's right, okay.
More
So,
audience.
that's right. So, that high school, 7 o'clock, Wednesday night, or whatever it is, that's your regular meeting schedule. The special meeting is the meeting that you have when you're not scheduled to meet. There's no magic word for what makes it special or not, it's just a meeting that you have when you're not scheduled to meet. Both of them need to be noticed at least 24 hours in advance. Your notice, your agenda, the terms are somewhat interchangeable. I want to make sure it's as specific as possible. You're telling people where you're going to meet, when you're going to meet, and what you're going to talk about. You want to try to avoid some of that sort of vague terminology that sometimes pops up on agendas. It's available 24 hours in advance. You should send one to City Hall, you can have one here. The difference between the regular and the special. At a regular meeting, should something arise that's not on that agenda, you can vote to add it to the agenda by a 2/3 vote of those of you who are present. At a special meeting, you cannot. So tonight, whatever's on that agenda, you called it a special meeting when you called it to order, that's all you can talk about. The other difference between the regular and the special is that a special meeting notice is required to be on your website if you have one that's available. Now, a little bit, a back up for just a second there. Back in 2008, the legislature passed a law that said all minutes, all agendas, all those things had to go up on websites. A lot of towns complained, especially some of the smaller ones. We don't have the personnel, we don't have the infrastructure, we can't do it, we don't have the time. Legislature passed the law anyway. 2 years later, maybe hearing the cry or maybe just now getting around to it, they peeled back that law and left the only requirement for municipal entities the special meeting notice. A lot of towns, I talked to Hartmanton just the other day. Someone was, badgering the clerk about things not being on websites, and I said, it's not required. Now, what happened in that 2-year period that it was the law was that many people got accustomed to it, and many people got a rhythm and were comfortable doing it, and found that it actually helped, and found that putting more things on websites actually made your lives easier. The effort of putting it on was more than worth reducing the number of phone calls, reducing the number of where is it, what is, because it was all right there. So whatever you're putting up there, don't stop, but understand that you're only in violation of the FOI Act if you fail to put a special meeting notice up there.
I got an email from the assistant clerk, city clerk, assistant city clerk, and they just went through an FOI training, and she said, I no longer have to send our agendas over there to be posted.
All right, there's not a no longer to that. That's kind of always been the law, but many cities, towns like to have them in town hall as well. You're not in violation of anything. Let me put it this way. You're not in violation of anything if you don't send them over there. But you might want to talk to them about a continuity. If people are used to looking for them over there, you don't want to confuse people. But if it's not there, you're not in violation. So that's kind of between you how to figure it out. That wasn't wrong, what they told you, but you might want to just think about that.
What they did on their website is our agendas, if you click on it on a city website, it just brings you to the agenda
Okay,
on our website.
that's probably fair. That's probably fair.
But if
yeah.
you walk into City Hall and you look at the bulletin board, it's not.
It's not there anymore. Again, you may want it there, and that's kind of something you really need to talk about. And by the way, I'm the guilty party there. A year or so ago, there was a complaint out of Newington with the Board of Education. And it didn't involve agendas and minutes, but in researching the decision, we thought we were going to go one way and had to go another because it was found that the Supreme Court made a ruling that basically said the boards of educations, the words that are used in the law are political subdivision of the state. That's what a town is. And it said that boards of education are separate political subdivisions of the state, which means that, so the agenda posting requirements are for the clerk of the political subdivision of the state, so that would mean your clerk. And so you technically don't have to send them there. And we pointed that out to some people, and they were stunned. But again, habits die hard, and you want to just make sure you're not leaving people in the dark with that situation. The emergency meeting is a meeting that I would really discourage you from using. First of all, the emergency meeting is an unnoticed meeting. And although my experiences with the RA remind me that everybody in Torrington always gets along, nobody doubts anybody, there's nobody suspicious of anybody. The first thing that happens when you have an unnoticed meeting, what are they doing? What are they hiding? Why aren't they telling us? It's just human nature. But beyond that, the reason beyond that is that the bar for what constitutes an emergency in the eyes of this law is set really high. It doesn't contemplate a lot of unnoticed meetings. So what you might think is an emergency might not rise to that level. So always think in terms of trying to schedule at least 24 hours out unless you've got a real tried and true emergency. A story. A few years ago, over in Ridgefield, the other side of the state, there was a situation where the assistant fire chief thought he was about to become the next chief. And then he found out he wasn't going to become the next chief. And he got really, really angry. And he barged into the first selectman's office one Friday afternoon. There was some screaming and yelling and cursing and things getting thrown and all that stuff. First selectman finally calms him down and says, look, you can curse at me all afternoon, but you're not going to be the next chief. Period. End of story. But I tell you what, you've been with us for a while.
I'll make you the interim chief while we look. He wasn't thrilled, but he left, pacified. Except that Ridgefield is a small town, like so many of our towns, like yours, you know, even as a big city, you're a small. It didn't take very long. Phone starts ringing off the hook, emails flying in, texts flying in. Oh my God, this is terrible, this is awful. He was insubordinate, he was rude. We don't want him anymore, get him out of here. So the first selectman thinks about it and says, well, there's some merit to that. And he decides he's going to have an emergency meeting the next morning, a Saturday morning. They have the emergency meeting, they decide the guy's no good, they fire him. They send somebody out to find him Saturday morning in the spring, so he's cleaning his gutters or something. They drag him down to town hall, he looks horrible. Thanks for coming down, you're fired. He gets mad all over again, he says, you can't fire me because I quit. They reconvene the emergency meeting and accept his resignation. He thinks about it, he says, wait a minute. What was the emergency? Remember I told you that bar is really high. What was the emergency? So he does what people do when they believe they've been denied access. In this case, he thought he was denied access to a meeting. He files a complaint with the FOI Commission. We could not mediate that one away. He was angry. Goes to the commission, the hearing officer and the commission say there was no emergency there. We know what the standard is. They didn't meet it. And our commission declares null and void everything that happened at that meeting. Now that's one of the strongest powers that our commission has, but it invokes it because it was clear, at least from the testimony, that the board didn't want him to know what they were going to do. That could be the end of the story, but it's not. Now, remember, that means he was fired and or quit at a meeting that didn't happen. But Ridgefield didn't agree with the decision and took an appeal and took it all the way to the state Supreme Court. January 2010, Ridgefield said, the Supreme Court says, Ridgefield, you were wrong. There was no emergency there, and we also declare null and void what happened at that meeting. The Supreme Court agreed with us. Doesn't always happen, but in this case it did. Now, I was doing one of these over in Plymouth, actually, around Christmas time a year ago. And I told that story, and I said, and I think they're still fighting about it, or they may have cleaned it up. And there's a guy laughing hysterically in the front row. I said, what's so funny? He says, well, I happen to be familiar with it. They're not done. They're still fighting about it. In fact, it wasn't until May of this year, 4.5 years after the decision, that they finally resolved the matter. I read a story in the Danbury News-Times that they finally agreed on a settlement, a settlement to the individual to make the whole thing go away. I mean, how much back pay did they owe him over all that time? What kind of medical, you know, all those things going around? And guess why they finally decided to settle the case? A judge actually pushed them into that settlement. There was a related suit, a CHRO or something like that, I'm not sure. The judge pushes them in that direction because the person that they hired to take the job was going to retire. And guess who one of the candidates for the job was? The same guy. He was back on the list for candidates, and it was just a mess. And the judge says, you better solve that one first before you go through this again. Now, does that mean that every time you screw up a meeting notice, you're going to have a null and void, and you're going to have all sorts of problems like that? No. But if you're thinking, gee, we don't need to worry about a notice, just remember that bar is high. Let that little light go off in your head and say, maybe we can wait 24 hours. Another one that was almost a disaster was a Board of Education gave a superintendent a new contract, okay? It was a close vote. Superintendent got a raise. Some people liked, some people didn't. The people who didn't said, wait a minute, the meeting wasn't properly noticed. It was improper. There's something wrong with the meeting. And they filed a complaint. So I called the chairman, by the way, if this ever happens, I called the chairman and said, look, to remove all doubt, have a new meeting and vote again, which is what Ridgefield should have done, by the way. Once he filed the complaint, they should have, and then the whole thing would have been gone. But they were both stubborn, and they didn't. And then there's silence on the other end of the phone when I said that to the board chair. Why do you think?
Because it dealt with the superintendent's salary.
No, because the makeup of the board had changed between the time that they voted and by the time the complaint was filed and processed, and the chairman said, I don't have the votes to pass the raise. So you know, what happens, then, you know, they're paying at one level and it goes back to another. So the bottom line is, they were found to be in violation, but we did not declare null and void. So they dodged a bullet there. But that's just sort of something to think about.
No, I'm just scratching.
Oh, okay, all right.
Was that Marconi in Ridgefield?
Oh, it sure was.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, who knows a lot about freedom of information, but in that case, it just didn't go his way.
You may have an emergency. You may have a situation, God forbid, where there's a leak in the roof and you have to get on it right away. And we had some chilling memories. Remember the heavy snows when the roofs were starting to sag? And we had to meet really quickly to get that damn snow off, and there was no money in the budget for that. You're hiring these big industrial firms to come in and take it up. So that's an emergency, keeping people safe, keeping the kids safe. If you have a situation like that, have your meeting, and within 72 hours, create minutes that reflect what the emergency was, who was there, and what you did about it. A word of caution with an emergency meeting: only talk about the emergency issue. There is a terrible temptation to want, well, as long as we're all here, let's talk about it. You don't want to do that. Only the emergency topic. Also, a little tip, not in the law, put it on your website. Call Bruno, say, look, we got an emergency, we got to deal with it. So it's clear you're not trying to hide something. They may complain, but at least you're not hiding it. You're saying, look, we've got this real emergency, we've got to move forward with that. Remember that your meetings are open to the public. Anybody can come. You don't want to have a sign-up sheet saying, well, wait a minute, you're a carpetbagger, you live in Harwinton, what are you doing here? That kind of thing. You don't want to do that. Anybody can come to a meeting. Anybody can audio or videotape a meeting. I know you're doing your own, but people walk in with cameras all the time. You can't stop them. Now, you can set parameters. If you've got a camera crew or a microphone person who's kind of annoying and running back and forth and disrupting things, you can set parameters and say, okay, this is the meeting room, but your camera stays over there. You can't make your parameters so restrictive that the camera can't take the picture or that the microphone can't hear, but you have a right to run an orderly meeting. You have a right to keep things sane. Yes?
What about in the case of an expulsion of a minor student for the open portion of the expulsion and someone's here with a
Okay.
camera?
The open portion of the expulsion, my experience with expulsion hearings was that it was all done in executive session. But again, if you're doing it in the open, it's public.
Well, we're really calling to order the meeting
Right.
in open.
Right.
Then we entertain the motion to go into
Right.
executive session, and then we reconvene in open
To
session.
take the vote.
read the rules.
Right. The open part is open. There's no way around that.
And there's no way to protect the students from having their,
Well, again, I can only speak from experience. The students came in, and we never had any, of course, with my board, because they were such darling little children. We never had one. But when we had an expulsion hearing, we went into executive session. If the student was there, the student was brought in, to answer questions and stuff like that, but the student was never really paraded in front of the open session.
right, I mean, it's not really the case here either, but
Yeah,
because of location, visible.
But if it's open and somebody's there with a camera, then you might take steps. If you don't want the child to be identified, you might want to take steps to stay out of the room until we come out to vote. That's tricky. We never faced a camera when we did our expulsion hearing, so it was never an issue, and obviously the student was never identified. So
Welcome to Torrington.
yeah. Let's just explore that a little bit. Would the expulsion hearing be in this room?
Yes.
Okay, so and the camera's out in the hall?
Oh, they were outside the building, they were in the hall, they were on the stairwell.
Yeah.
There's a few.
I'm just not sure, I gotta be honest with you, I'm just not sure there's anything you can do under those circumstances. And you wanted to talk to the student, or students. That was part of.
But they're part of the
your
process, because
Well, if you have a stipulated agreement, sometimes the student didn't show up, but,
That's correct.
for the most part, you want the kid there, and usually with parents. That's tough. I'm a little stumped on that one, because you're dealing with the conflict between the open meeting and FERPA and things like that. But,
if you had two attached rooms, and you had the child and his family waiting in one room, can the board open the meeting and then
You could
bring
do
the
that.
child in?
you could do that. You're not obligated to identify the student. We all know that, so if, that might be a way around it, yeah.
And they could,
Yeah, it's a good question, but yeah.
How big is that
it doesn't
closet?
stop.
How big is that closet?
That,